Delighted to welcome you to this Wednesday's SSP seminar. It's a special seminar for two reasons. Our speaker is one of the newest members of the program and also an illustrious graduate of the program. So I'm delighted to welcome Austin Long, who joined SSP as a senior nuclear fellow this summer. He previously served as deputy director for strategic stability on the Joint Staff as part of a much longer career in the Pentagon. Prior to that, he also worked at Rand University and was an associate professor at SEPA at Columbia University. Interestingly, not all of you will know this, but his dissertation had nothing to do with nuclear weapons.
You would recognize that.
So he's a very talented sort of scholar and practitioner of security studies, and we're delighted to have him here today to talk about sort of his reflections on nuclear policy. Welcome, Austin.
Thank you so much. And it is really great to be back at a Wednesday seminar, giving one, lo, these 23 years after I first went to one. Things look a little different, but I think still much the same, though I do miss seeing Carl Kaysen quietly eating fruit with a knife and fork in the back and thinking of cogent things to say. But other than that, looks much the same. I am not going to talk too long, I promise, mostly because I don't like to listen to myself, but I do want to set the table for a dialogue, and this is very much more sort of what I did on my extended summer vacation in the Pentagon than it is advancement of sort of academic theory, but I'm happy to talk about that as we get into the discussion. So the Pentagon will tell you have to have an agenda for everything, so I'll talk a little bit about who I am and why I'm here, bits of the Department of Defense, a couple of nuclear posture reviews I was part of, the Russia invasion of Ukraine, and then the Wagner coup attempt. A little observation on new nuclear capabilities and sort of the differences with the Cold War years. And then I'll culminate by talking about 2024, as I call it, my year of Russian space nuke. And then we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. How did I end up in the Pentagon? Even while I was a grad student at MIT, I worked in a variety of roles in the broader national security enterprise. I worked for a defense contractor known as SAIC a bit. I worked quite a lot for the Rand Corporation. I did some consulting through a sort of smaller firm for the Office of Secretary of Defense. I also deployed to both Iraq and Afghanistan as a civilian through Rand, and had done a bunch of different things in that enterprise. What I had not done is seen how the national security sausage is made inside the Pentagon, or inside the building, as people like to say. The building is the, sort of metonym for the Pentagon. So I'd never seen that, and I was like, gosh, that's kind of a hole in my golf swing, even though I don't play golf. How might I fix that? So the Council on Foreign Relations offers an international affairs fellowship. For a while, they ran one that was funded by Stanton that was specific to nuclear issues. So I competed for and received one of those in 2014, which allowed me to spend a year in the Pentagon, which is a place I'd visited but not actually dwelt. And then for people that were kind of mysterious to me at that point, they had been, I think, in my mind, those jerks in the Pentagon who tell me dumb stuff to do when I'm deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I kind of knew who they were. I see some head nodding. I kind of knew who they were, but not really. So I was like, okay, this is cool. So 2014 to 2015, so just to put your mind in context, I started in September of 14, so just a few months after the first invasion of Ukraine, as the Obama administration was sort of waking up to the fact that the relationship with Russia was quite different than what it had hoped it would be. And it was absolutely a fascinating year. I learned a ton, just sort of three of the things. This was also the beginning of the recognition that the Russians were in pretty substantial violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So one of the things I worked on that year was, what are our military options to respond to this violation, and what might we do with that? I also got to do a lot with classified wargaming, which I'd kind of done a little bit with as an outside participant, but I actually got to be part of designing and running one related to nuclear issues. So that was really cool. And then I got to see, and we can talk more about this in Q&A, how the planning guidance for nuclear plans are developed. So that starts with the president, flows down to the Secretary of Defense, the chairman, and on down to U.S. Strategic Command, which actually develops the plans. And so I got to see sort of how those different bureaucratic processes work. So just an absolutely fascinating year. Worked with a great group of people, as I'll talk to a little bit more in a minute. So the Joint Staff, what's its deal? it derives its authority, to the extent that it has any, from Title 10 of the U.S. Code, and particularly from the enumeration of the responsibilities of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And there are a bunch, but probably the central one from my vantage point, which, as I'll talk to in a minute, was in the J5, or the Strategy, Plans, and Policy Directorate, was that by statute, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the principal military advisor to the president, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. So that was a lot of what we did, was help the chairman formulate military advice related to strategy, plans, policy, so he could provide that advice. That involved working with the National Security Council, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Uniformed Services, the combatant commands, the intelligence community, the National Nuclear Security Administration, the State Department, and a whole bunch of other people who find me really quite insufferably annoying. Because I was always that guy who would tell them why they were wrong and then have the footnotes to back it up. One thing I'll note about the chairman is advice is not command. So even though the Secretary of Defense and the president issue orders typically through the chairman to the combatant commanders who are responsible for the operational military forces, the chairman doesn't tell them what to do. Lordy, would they let me know that. And also, he doesn't tell the services how to spend money to organize, train, and equip military equipment. So the senior most military officer in the country neither gives operational commands, though he may transmit them, nor does he tell services what to buy. It kind of sounds like a lame job, doesn't it, right? You don't control money or people or combat forces. But in fact, the power, as I'll talk to in a minute, is really about that military advice and influence. It has the nature of that advice has changed over time, but it gives you a lot of influence in the sense that you get to communicate the senior most military officer's advice on behalf of the Joint Chiefs, on behalf of the combatant commanders, to the Secretary of Defense and the President, and through the National Security Council process. So it's an important position, it's an influential position, but it is an influence position, not a command position. I'm happy to talk more about that distinction. It's really exhausting influencing people all the time. I want to have a special shout out to something I worked a great deal with, which is the Nuclear Weapons Council. The Nuclear Weapons Council is by statute the body that governs the relationship between the Department of Defense, which will of course employ nuclear weapons if called upon by the president, and the Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Administration, which actually are responsible for building those weapons. It's a weird relationship. You have a monopoly-monopsony relationship, one supplier, one buyer, and it's an interesting relationship. The Nuclear Weapons Council is the mechanism, interagency mechanism that governs that, and the vice chairman is by statute a member of that. So I spent a lot of time directly supporting the vice chairman in his role on the Nuclear Weapons Council, which I'll come back to, but I'm happy to talk about any aspect of that in the Q&A. Finally, Taylor mentioned my title. What is a deputy director anyway? So in the sort of Byzantine hierarchy of the Pentagon, it's not quite an archduke, but maybe it's better than a grand vizier. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, obviously at the top of the Joint Staff hierarchy, but the Joint Staff is fairly flat. You have the vice chairman as his sort of statutory principal deputy, and then you have a bunch of 3 stars that serve in various directorates along the Napoleonic Staff Code line. J5, as I mentioned, is Strategy, Plans, and Policy. So the title for that 3-star, who is my immediate boss, is Director, Strategy, Plans, and Policy. The deputy directors are his subordinates that essentially handle aspects of his portfolio. So he had a number that handled regional issues, a Europe, NATO, Russia deputy director, et cetera. And then we had some that handled functional issues. I ended up working exclusively in the Deputy Directorate for Strategic Stability and ultimately was the Deputy Director. By rank, I was equivalent to a 2-star general, which is, it's not chopped liver, but it's not all that much in the Pentagon. It meant I got to brew the coffee that I then took to the person who took the coffee to the chairman. My team would, of course, grind the coffee for me. But it meant in the interagency, I represented more at the assistant secretary level. So in the interagency process of the National Security Council, the sort of lowest rung is at the assistant secretary level, and that's where I represented. So that was where I was in the pecking order. Definitely solid middle management. How did I get back to the Joint Staff after that wonderful year 2014, 2015? Grad students, I did not get tenure. It could happen to you. There's life after that, I assure you. So after returning to RAND full-time for a period of time, I decided that I wanted to get back to the Joint Staff, and I took advantage of something known as the Highly Qualified Expert Program, which I will talk to you in more detail if you'd like, but the short version is it brings people in from the outside into government who are not part of the civil service, but they become sort of term-limited civil servants to provide expertise on particular issues. So I joined the Joint Staff again in the fall of 2018 as a highly qualified expert, and immediately got into a bunch of different issues, which again, I'm more setting the table for a conversation. So first was the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review was complete by the time I joined. I'd participated in it a little bit through the RAND Corporation, but we had to do a lot to implement it. And so there were changes, for example, in some of our capabilities, which I'll come back to later, but one that we actually instantiated was a low-yield submarine launched ballistic missile. So we're part of that implementation, as well as just sort of addressing the fact that the security environment in 2018 was substantially worse than the previous Nuclear Posture Review 8 years earlier. I got to spend a lot of time doing arms control stuff again. So that picture there is from the P5 meeting, so the Permanent Security Council members that are also recognized nuclear weapon states. We would occasionally meet, and so that was in Beijing in 2019. I also got to return to see INF put out of its misery. So after the several years that I'd worked on it previously, the Trump administration finally decided that Russia's violation was sufficiently egregious to end that treaty. So I was part of that process, and I've now gotten to put the old Yeller treaties out of their misery several times now, and I'm happy to talk about that. Open skies, for example, conventional forces in Europe, any number of treaties that have perhaps outlived their usefulness. And then finally, in 2020, our office, which had primarily focused on nuclear issues, as the title Strategic Stability suggests, we picked up additional responsibilities as different components of the joint force became more important. So as you'll recall, 2019, we established a Space Command and a Space Force. So space was becoming increasingly important. We'd had a division within the J5 that handled that. They decided to group that with strategic stability. So I picked up that responsibility. I also picked up cyber capabilities, so which led me into this wonderful world of the dual hat, which is to say the director of the National Security Agency is also the combatant commander for Cyber Command. So he has both intelligence community and military roles and responsibilities, as well as authorities, which is quite a contentious issue, as I've learned over the past 5 years. But in general, it was a good gig. I got to do quite a lot in terms of learning how a variety of functional capabilities worked. And one thing I noticed almost right away was the more these functional capabilities were grouped together, the more sense they made. There were a lot of things that didn't make sense about nuclear command and control unless you understood certain aspects of space. There were certain things that could or couldn't be done about adversary capabilities in terms of, say, countering weapons of mass destruction that made a lot more sense if you understood cyber and information warfare capabilities, which is a shame because the Congress has inflicted on the Office of Secretary of Defense balkanization of those responsibilities. It's created additional assistant secretaries for cyber, for space, now one for nuclear responsibilities, and it's pulled these capabilities that used to sit under one assistant secretary apart. And I think, well, I understand why Congress did it. It was to emphasize the importance of these mission areas. The balkanization, I think, has been a bit problematic. And again, happy to talk more about that in Q&A. So then 2021, the Biden administration comes in, and boy, do they want to do a lot of stuff. So we started with a nuclear posture review and a missile defense review in 2021. And I'll talk about sort of two aspects of that, though I'm happy to talk about any bit you want in Q&A. The first was, as we were completing the nuclear posture review, the Biden administration essentially announced the AUKUS deal, which, for those of you that recall, essentially torpedoed, pun intended, the French plan to sell non-nuclear submarines to the Australians. They were a bit cross, as my British wife would say in understatement form. However, and here I want to give the French a lot of credit, when we came that fall to talk to them about the nuclear posture review, I would characterize their official level complaining to us as direct, serious, and then immediately separated from the important nuclear issues we're going to talk about. So I want to give the French credit, and I'll come back to that. I think the French, and perhaps I'm a little bit of a Francophile, but I think the French get a little bit of a bad rap in the nuclear sphere. Some of it sort of historically perhaps deserved, but I think a bit out of date. And again, happy to talk more about that. The bigger shadow over the Biden nuclear posture review was, of course, the transformation and modernization of China's nuclear force, which became relatively apparent in public, but was, I think, understood even as the Biden folks came in. And in fact, that was one of the things I told the IC to be ready for in 2020 was we need to make sure we have the most updated intelligence ready for the nuclear posture review so that the folks coming in who have not even necessarily had security clearances over the past few years can get up to speed very quickly on what's happening. And again, I think a variety of senior US officials have described what China is doing as a strategic breakout, a breathtaking breakout, et cetera. I'll just emphasize it is not just an expansion in the sense of more numbers. It's not just a sort of qualitative change in diversity of capabilities. It is a thoroughgoing transformation, as I've said a number of times, including on a podcast recently, and was made fun of by Taylor Fravel for saying it so much. A transformation of, a transformation of how they think about nuclear command and control, about how they think about the readiness of their forces, et cetera. And so that was really something the Biden administration, which I think, I mean, it's pretty well understood. The president had views on nuclear weapons. He wanted to the extent practical, minimize those roles. And I think in this case, to their credit, the incoming political appointees internalized the intelligence and recognized that this was going to be a challenge to be dealt with. And so again, happy to talk more about that, but that was a big shadow cast over that nuclear posture review. We also had a bunch more reviews. We did a space review. We did another dual hat review, which I got to work with my former boss and Bostonian, General Joe Dunford, just an amazing deep thinker. It's easy to say that about folks, but I mean, just across the board, a class act and deep thinker on that, and we hoped we'd put that issue to bed. I think we failed, but that's life. I also learned, as many of you have probably learned, that the reward for doing good work and being competent is more work. So it turned out that cyber policy was kind of adjacent to signals intelligence policy, and signals intelligence policy was importantly affected by something known as FISA 702, which deals with certain authorities to monitor electronic communications in certain circumstances. It's a really important tool legally, and it was up for renewal. Somebody had to get the chairman smart on this, and I became that somebody because people were like, that guy's weird and he kind of understands this stuff. So I became surprisingly fluent in both the legality and technicality of signals intelligence in FISA 702. Again, just because I ended up being a sort of magnet for functional tasks. Also, we had a change in the vice chairman, as I note. So General John Hyten served 2019 to 2021. Admiral Chris Grady replaced him in 2021 and will retire here in a couple of months. Russia, Ukraine. I know you guys are familiar with this issue. From my perspective, it started at sort of two pivotal moments, right as we completed the nuclear posture review, which certainly alluded to Russia, but I don't think anyone had anticipated early in the drafting that we were going to be in the midst of a nuclear crisis on or about February of 2022. And it also came as I became the deputy director. My previous boss retired in February as well, so sort of my first days on the job were as the Russians were invading Ukraine. So I will briefly touch on a couple of things. I'm happy to talk about any of these or something else in more detail. Zaporizhia. So I was driving into work and I was like, I better get in early. The Russians just invaded Ukraine. It's sort of like early March. And so I was already on the road at 6 o'clock in the morning and my phone rings and it was like, hey, why are you not already in here? I'm like, I'm coming. Well, the Russians are attacking a nuclear plant and we kind of need to know what that means. I'm like, okay, be right there. And so at 7 o'clock that morning, we had an interagency call about the significance of Zaporizhia, which it did not go as poorly as it could have, is how I would characterize that, but that doesn't mean it was a good scene by any means. But it was certainly a notable welcome to the job with 6 o'clock not being early enough to be in. As I learned, that would be a large part of my lot in life over the next few years. Another thing that was interesting was there was a substantial amount of cyberspace and electronic warfare activity, some of which has been reported on in the public. The Russians, for example, launched a cyber attack against Viasat, which is a satellite communications provider that knocked out a lot of communications in Ukraine, but also beyond the borders of Ukraine, including affecting the electric power grid of Europe. This was an area of great nervousness, I would say. The potential for cyberspace and or electronic warfare activity to drive escalation. And when I say the shadow of nuclear escalation hung over the crisis, it was a big deal in everyone's minds. From my perspective, I think the Biden administration, some of its folks were probably overly concerned about it, but I also understand the concern. So this was something that I think we reflected on quite a lot, was how do these non-kinetic activities that in themselves might not be terribly escalatory. There's a lot of scholarly literature on the non-escalatory nature of cyber attacks, but in the context of a nuclear crisis, a lot of concern. Then we get to the fall of 2022, when, as I think most people are aware, there's a lot of public reporting that the United States was concerned about the possibility of Russian nuclear use surrounding its potential withdrawal and failed withdrawal or unsuccessful withdrawal around Kherson. And that we were quite concerned about this. And I'll just say, for my part, I generally think that was true. Happy to talk more about it in Q&A. But I will say it was a dog that did not bark, thankfully. But I think there are a lot of conclusions being drawn when fundamentally the conditions, which at least I believe were what the Russians needed to be met to think about nuclear use, were not met. The withdrawal from Kherson was actually reasonably well done. Fighting withdrawal across a body of water is pretty tricky, and a Russian military that had not done very well in the previous few months actually pulled that one off pretty well. And so therefore, I think it's an important event, but one that we should not draw conclusions about at least too many conclusions about the efficacy of US actions to deter nuclear use when the conditions for nuclear use were probably not met. Again, happy to talk about more than that. And then finally, a really spicy 36 hours in my life, which was the attempted coup in a country with thousands of nuclear weapons, which is to say Wagner, in June of 2023. This was an interesting day for me. I got to go into the Pentagon in my gym jams on Saturday morning and talk to the Brits and make sure we were all on the same page. And then I went out, as the picture alludes to, into the Pentagon courtyard to text with the French, because we didn't have quite the same level of secure comms. So it was more along the lines of, we cool? Yeah, we cool. And I ended up having a nosebleed, probably from stress, but maybe it was just allergies. Two of the things I'll note additionally that came out of at least my perspective, and Celeste Wallander, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs at the time, is now at the University of Pennsylvania, I think is very good on this. On both sides, the shadow of nuclear escalation constrained escalation, but it did not prevent it. And both sides, I think, took salami slice steps towards escalation. So at first, the United States quite reticent to provide long-range firepower. Obviously, over time, that has changed. The Ukrainians were able to avail themselves of firepower. We provided support to their indigenous long-range firepower. Our allies provided additional support, et cetera. So the analogy of boiling the frog, I think, was a posit. Both sides slowly turned the heat up on one another. The Russians, of course, launched sabotage. You've seen what they've done recently along the periphery of NATO, et cetera. So both sides were sort of slowly boiling one another, both mindful of the possibility of escalation. So for a long time, all of the support to Ukraine was flowing through one airfield in Poland. If the Russians had wanted to strike that airfield, it would have been easy peasy lemon squeezy. They did not. Sabotage seemed like a more sort of stability, instability, paradox-friendly way to go about that. And likewise, the United States also limited what it was willing to do. So happy to talk more about that. And the other is, as I mentioned with the French, they were actually really good partners, I think, in general, with the Brits and the United States on this. We had a lot of conversations about every aspect of the conflict. And while I won't say we always agreed, the fact that everyone acknowledged that it was important we understand what we were each signaling together and independently, and how we might go about planning, I think, was really important. So again, I think the French often get a bad rap. Again, some of it potentially deserved from past behavior, but I think today, certainly the war in Europe has been pretty transformative, I think, of French views in general. Hopefully I'll still be welcome in Paris after saying that. Okay, why can't we have nice things in the nuclear space? It's because we let our nuclear complex rot. Those of you that own homes know that when you defer maintenance, the bills just go up, and we deferred maintenance on our nuclear complex for a long time. And that's not just the physical plant, though there's a lot of that. Some of it still, as the fine folks at Y12 will tell you, dating back to the Manhattan Project, but also the sort of intellectual apparatus that goes with capabilities. And so beginning with the 2018 nuclear posture review and then sort of afterwards, we thought about how we get capabilities beyond the basic modernization that the United States is undertaking that was essentially designed in 2010, 2011 in that security environment. So there's a recognition in both the Trump and the Biden administration that probably what was sufficient for a security environment we saw, pre the first invasion of Ukraine, pre-China strategic transformation, pre what's happened with the DPRK's nuclear program. If it was sufficient in 2011, probably you at least need, in the words of the recent Strategic Posture Commission, some more and or different capabilities. But as I say, we're not really well set up for that. And I'll talk about 3 capability vignettes. Again, happy to talk more in the discussion, but just to flag them. The first was the W-93, which is a warhead for the Navy's submarine launched ballistic missile that is currently under development, will field probably next decade. When we began this, it was known as the next Navy warhead, and everyone recognized we had to do something. Our current warheads for the Navy system were both, they're Cold War vintage, still very reliable, but not going to last the next 100 years. So everybody acknowledged we were going to need some kind of new warhead for the Navy. In the military system, at least as it existed at the time, it's kind of undergoing a bit of a transformation of its own now. There was something called the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, also exists in statute, that sort of validated requirements for new weapon systems, and it had a whole process by which it did that. That process explicitly, in like a one sentence, was like, this does not apply to nuclear weapons. And so when it came time to create a new nuclear weapon, really W-93 is the first really new, even though it's a little bit not new, because it's all stuff we've done before. We're just kind of putting it together in a different way. We didn't know how to set the requirements for it. We were like, who validates these requirements? The JROC said it's not them. Who else gets to do this? And so there was a lot of like, well, the Nuclear Weapons Council can do it, but like it doesn't actually say anywhere in the statute that that's within their authority. And so we kind of fudged it, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we fixed it by changing the JROC process, but initially we fudged it. So that's where we were in terms of new nuclear capabilities, really just 6 years ago, was we didn't even know how to validate the requirements for them. So we fixed a lot of that. The 2018 nuclear posture review, as I mentioned, called for a low-yield version of a submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead. It also called for restoring a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, which the United States had for a long time. It's known by the great DoD acronym of Sea-Launched Cruise Missile Nuclear, or SLCM-N. Rolls right off the tongue. So this capability had been in the U.S. arsenal, though not deployed until the Obama administration. And so the view in 2018 was, we had this capability pretty recently. It can't be that hard to put it back into the service. No, that turned out to be more or less totally wrong. And in fact, you had an interesting circumstance where there was an intersection of bureaucracy and politics that meant, lo these 7 years later, we're still not very far along, though we're starting to make progress on the deployment of a new nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. So bureaucracy in this case was the analysis of alternatives process, which is again part of how we develop capabilities. That analysis of alternatives process became not an analysis of different ways to deploy a sea-launched cruise missile, but alternatives to a sea-launched cruise missile. This caused some degree of consternation amongst those of us who thought the nuclear posture review had been pretty clear on what was asked for, but we didn't win that argument. And so the clock ran out on the first Trump administration, and the new Biden administration, as part of its nuclear posture review, decided to cancel the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, which of course is the president's prerogative, until the Congress decides to say, no, yea, verily, you shall have a nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. And indeed was very specific in the direction to do so, down to saying what warhead should be used, which is usually way more in the details than the Congress gets. Negotiations subsequently ensued. But the point is, this was a very interesting interaction of bureaucracy and politics in terms of capabilities. Finally, the thing I'm sort of proudest of, which is the B-6113 gravity bomb. I can take some measure of credit and or responsibility, depending on how one feels about nuclear weapons, for the decision to deploy this. The United States was in the process in 2022 of building its next generation gravity bomb, the B-6112, and some bureaucratic entrepreneurs from the nuclear weapons complex began suggesting, hey, look, the idea for the 6112 was, again, sort of part of this earlier time. The security environment looked different. essentially for no cost to the government over and above what the government's already paying, we can make some of these 6112s have a higher yield. And we already have some high yield gravity bombs, so maybe you'd want that. And when they briefed me on that, I was like, you had me at hello. How do we do this? As the note in the upper right-hand corner indicates, that was maybe not the feeling of everyone. And so an interesting experiment in bureaucratic influence began that ultimately, and I can say proudly, successfully culminated in the decision to field the B6113, the higher yield variant of the nuclear gravity bomb. And it began fielding earlier this year, ahead of schedule. So we can actually do things occasionally faster and cheaper than one might think. Happy to talk more about that in Q&A. And you should ask Vipin about that. He swears he has some role in all this. Finally, 2024, my year of Russia's space nuke. As I think people are aware, in the sort of winter 23-24 timeframe, the United States came to believe that the Russian government was developing a nuclear weapon for counter space purposes that would live on orbit in violation of the Outer Space Treaty, and that it might field it relatively soon. That is to say, relatively soon over the course of the year 2024. This led to a fairly significant policy fire drill, as one might imagine. I felt a bit like a character in a Tom Clancy novel where it's like, I'm just an analyst. Nope, you got to come up with all the answers on this. So it was really an opportunity for the Joint Staff, and I will say particularly my team, to shine, because there were a lot of questions. Why were the Russians doing this? What did they hope to achieve? When might they use it if they did deploy it? What can we do about it, either before, during, after, etc. launch? What can we do about it? We played a pretty big role in that, and again, I'm happy to talk in detail about it in Q&A, but it required a pretty big effort. And one of the cooler things about being a flag officer equivalent on the Joint Staff is I can actually give people medals, or I could give people medals. And I was proud to give my team and others on the Joint Staff medals for their effort here. I mean, it was a truly monumental team effort. I would love to tell you as much of it as I can. Sadly, much of it is still classified. But it was a very stressful but very interesting time. Happy to talk about, for example, what the dynamics of the fact that the Russians now know that we know about this capability potentially due to escalation. Because, of course, unlike the Doomsday Machine, this was probably a capability, given that it violated a pretty significant treaty, they were going to keep a secret. And, of course, if you don't tell the world, how can you deter with it? Well, now that the world knows, how does that change the dynamics? And that was something we grappled with quite a lot. Though it took, I think, at least a couple of years off my life to do so. With that, I will conclude and look forward to discussion. That's my last day on the Joint Staff with my favorite shirt, which some of you have already seen, and my deputy slash successor there on the left, looking at his phone, probably trying to figure out where he was going to get his next drink. So over to you guys.
I didn't realize Aloha Casual was exceptional. That's good.
Only on the Joint Staff.
All right. So Sam, I see your hand first. Everyone else, please keep them up, and I will keep the list running.
Thanks so much for the talk, Dr. Long. I was actually wondering if you could talk a little bit, since you brought up the Wagner coup, how sort of instability in the U.S. transition process in 2020 and 2021, to put it mildly, affected adversaries' perceptions of the, stability of the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and sort of what steps, people lower down the road take along that line, and what steps they might take in the future.
Yeah, I mean, at least from my perspective, there was no instability in the U.S. arsenal. It was very clear who was in charge at all times. We have one president at a time, and that was the case through 2020 and into 2021. Adversary perceptions of that may vary. I think, as most people are aware, it seems that the PRC, for example, believed that there would be some sort of military action in that fall as a sort of October surprise redux. But at least from my perspective, there was no arsenal instability. I mean, the same folks that go to work every day went to work every day. The National Military Command Center staffed 24/7 as it always is. I mean, that was sort of business as usual. I mean, even, in sort of the worst days, however one wants to code that, it was pretty clear the arsenal was in good hands. There's a 2-finger there.
Oh, is it 2-finger break?
Yeah, I think that's really isn't better.
Okay.
I have a vague recollection that at that time, Mark Milley made some statements that maybe have had the term regular order or regular procedures or regular something. Right? And there was a lot of, back and forth in the public about what exactly did this mean. Could you elaborate on what that means when a certain person of that stature uses that language about something so important?
Sure. And again, this is my perspective on what he meant. I saw General Milley a good bit, but I can't proclaim to know what he thought. But to my perspective, there are very well established processes by which the president governs nuclear weapons. I mean, we have ultimately at the sort of end of that process what's called a nuclear decision conference, but that requires communication with the military, though it doesn't necessarily require consent of the military as long as it's a lawful order, right? That's what I think Milley meant, was all of the procedures by which the president would decide to employ nuclear weapons remained operative, and that included that orders had to be lawful. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I mean, it partly does, but you're talking about process
Yes.
that normally happen.
Yes.
So Milley clearly had those processes.
Yes.
There are other outside critics who say that those processes can be circumvented by the president if he wishes to do so. Right. And my impression was that Milley was essentially saying only address orders if they go through these processes, which we hope would be standard, but which in law, in fact, are not standard.
Sure. It would be intriguing to think about how the president might circumvent these processes, because they're fundamentally about the issuance of orders, right? And I mean, there's not a button, right? It's metaphorical. There's not a button the president presses. So he has to give orders to the military. Those have to flow through some mechanism. It's not clear how that mechanism is meaningfully circumventable. I mean, you have to have someone issue the order. There are codes involved, as I think is well understood, and the president doesn't have those codes. He has an authentication, but he says, this is what I want to do, and then that translates into action. So it is not, again, I want to be clear, the Secretary of Defense does not have a veto on what the president does, right? So this idea that there's a collective decision making is not right, but military orders still have to be issued and obeyed, and if they are not lawful, they're not supposed to be obeyed. So that's to the extent that there is a control mechanism, it is the lawful nature of the orders.
Brought up the French quite a bit, and so I wanted to get your thoughts on this idea back in March, as the administration was sort of signaling less of an emphasis on NATO, of the French nuclear umbrella and sort of a European nuclear deterrent from the Europeans. And they went in and then provided some conditions on how that would work, and it seemed to kind of preclude it from actually being a thing that happened. But I wanted to get your thoughts on how likely it is that France might integrate more with the extended nuclear deterrent, and whether that's feasible or even something that we might want them to do.
I don't really think it's feasible. And the reason is not that the French don't have good nuclear weapons, but just extended nuclear deterrence is really quite hard. Most of the Cold War nuclear story is about how to make that commitment credible. And the United States did quite a lot. Now, some people in this room probably think we did way too much and more than was necessary. But nonetheless, we felt like we had to do quite a lot in terms of deploying capabilities in order to make that extended deterrent credible. The French do not have anything like what that is, and they don't even at the doctrinal level have enough. So you're going to do your their sort of last final warning shot is also, if you'll let me borrow a line from Yes, Prime Minister, it's also your first warning shot, right? So like they just marched into the outer edges of Estonia, and you're going to launch your last and final warning shot. Is that really credible, their government in Paris? So I think absent a lot of doctrinal policy and probably capability work, it's going to be really tough for the French to meaningfully extend deterrent. I suspect they know that, but political level vague utterances, which the French have made at various points throughout the past 70 years, are probably about as far as they can go.
Josh.
Hey, Jonathan. I'm a huge fan. I assigned your books with Brandon on students. For the purpose of this Q&A, I just want to ask you two questions based on with my nuclear revolution experience. Many more of us and counter-revolutionary results. So let's do kind of a
Deniers, man, that's tough. That makes me sound like I'm denying something really,
let's do more
really
kind of
serious.
get a better idea of where you're coming from. So my first question is this idea of the so-called two-tier problem. I understand correctly, the idea being that the U.S. nuclear arsenal of developed as one with nuclear mind, and the others two, so somehow erodes and undermines the potency of the U.S. nuclear power. But interestingly enough, at the same time, many of the same people who read about the inadequacy, the supposed inadequacy, the massive, truly massive U.S. nuclear arsenal, seem to believe that even a rudimentary nuclear arsenal in the hands of, say, Iran or North Korea would be a huge deal. It would just be a drastic change to the balance of power. So if you can help me kind of wrap my head around what this idea of two-tier problem is, isn't this just conventionalization 101? You stack up nuclear weapons as if they were just ordinary conventional weapons, they fall short of however many your adversaries have been, all hell breaks loose. But that's clearly not how it looks. How do you respond? My second question. The same thing.
All right, well, I'm going to unload on the first one, and I'm sure there will be a two-finger. We're going to have a whole panel on this next week, but.
We got time.
Is this idea of China's nuclear expansion. From orthodox nuclear defense theory, what could potentially undermine strategic stability in East Asia is U.S. nuclear security, or the belief among U.S. policymakers that they might enjoy something akin to superiority in a crisis. But this is actually what exacerbates what kind of inadvertent escalation dynamics, so on and so forth during a crisis. So from that perspective, one might say that if China's nuclear arsenal expands, they are essentially moving towards putting it back into equilibrium in a situation where the U.S. was trying to throw a wrench into the equilibrium, this strategic superiority. So all this hand-wringing about China's nuclear expansion, so on and so forth, how do you intellectually justify that? Too much.
Quite easily, I assure you. Do you want to take Barry's two-finger before I respond? Oh.
He's already losing control of the one question.
Oh, I see. Excellent. Yes. Well, clearly. Yes. Well, it's appropriate that questions are merged in this setting. So,
Are they truly independent?
So on your first question, I think you just conflated a few things. So, and I just wrote a post on this last night on our little Substack that Vipin and Pranay and I do. And Charlie, I think, has been very clear on this, and I hope will be equally clear in his forthcoming critique of people like me who critique the nuclear revolution. The operative component of the nuclear revolution set of hypotheses is mutual second strike, right? There's no chance that the DPRK will have the same level of mutual second strike, much less Iran, that China has today, much less the Russians. So it is not a mad dyad, at least at the present time, between the DPRK and the United States. So you can just bracket the DPRK and Iran from the theory of the nuclear revolution. Why do United States policymakers nonetheless worry about them? Because a nuclear weapon is still a big deal, right? It's not like it can't ruin your whole day. But the theories of the nuclear revolution are specific to the establishment and inescapability of MAD as a fact, not a policy. So that's really what we're talking about to the extent we're talking about anything with a two-peer problem. Nuclear weapons can be a big deal without having had this transformative effect. So why is the two-peer problem a big deal? And here I'll pull in a little bit of the answer to your second question. Strategic stability has really never been the United States goal, right? This is why I would have liked to have changed my job title from Deputy Director Strategic Stability to Deputy Director Strategic Supremacy. But that was probably not going to fly, though in the Department of War, maybe I could have got away with it. So It's because the United States, because it asks more of its nuclear deterrent than any other country, right? We extend deterrence to more than 30 countries globally. No other country comes close to that. So the requirements of making that extended deterrent credible are that you will, in certain extreme circumstances, no more defined than that, to the vital national interests of the United States or its allies, you will employ nuclear weapons first, right? And if the adversary has this condition that Charlie and Bob Jervis have, I think, aptly described of mutual second strike, is that really a credible threat? Policymakers have always felt uncomfortable with that. We have developed options for what we've called at various times limited escalation, limited nuclear options, escalation control, et cetera. But policymakers have never felt entirely comfortable, in my view, with the so-called threat that leaves something to chance. And in fact, if you look at the history of US and Soviet nuclear command and control, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides started to tighten up on command and control to avoid threats that leave something to chance. Policymakers want a threat that leaves nothing to chance. And so this is really what drives US nuclear policy for deterrence and extended nuclear deterrence. And that credible threat of first use requires, presumably in my view, the ability to limit damage to escape from this condition of mutual second strike or mutually assured destruction. The two-peer problem, I don't think completely sort of annihilates the US deterrent. It doesn't make the deterrent incredible, but it makes it both more difficult and more complicated. I will flag just one way in which it makes more complicated. Well, let's say, God forbid, there's a limited nuclear war between the United States and one of its peers, but all of our theories of escalation control actually work, and after a smattering of nuclear use, both sides are like, well, that was a terrible idea, we need to stop. How do you come out of that scenario when there's a third peer that may have generated its nuclear forces as well? Both sides want to back down, metaphorically holster their guns, but there's one undamaged potential adversary of both that has generated its nuclear forces. It was complicated enough to think about how we would step away from that in a bipolar world. It'll be very interesting to see how we do it. So I think it makes it more complicated and more difficult. It doesn't mean the sort of end of US extended nuclear deterrence. It's just a lot more challenging. And on the strategic stability question, the United States has never wanted strategic stability. We want what I've termed, stealing from my friends at the RAND Corporation, optimal instability. We want adversaries to be concerned enough about the possibility of US nuclear use that they avoid crisis, because they know in a crisis the United States could credibly use nuclear weapons first, including to limit damage to itself and its allies. On the other hand, we don't want it to be so unstable that any crisis will escalate rapidly because the adversary believes that the United States is going to promptly launch a massive attack on it, right? So that, in my telling, is what the United States has pursued for deterrence, not strategic stability qua strategic stability. That was a long answer, but there's two questions.
I need to reestablish deterrence.
Please do.
Well, you need to reestablish liberal institutions.
Which is to say, one question per customer. Obviously, many of you may have multiple questions. That's great. And if we have time, we'll come back and do a second round. Someone else is there. Is that a one finger or a two finger? One finger. Okay.
As long as it's not a middle finger.
You're on the list. So I'll come back to you. All right, Mariana.
Yes, all right. I'll do the self-restraint thing and ask just one question, even though I had two. So, Austin, thank you very much. First of all, you mentioned trilateral nuclear consultations between US, UK, and France throughout the war in Ukraine. Could you expand on that a bit? And to the extent that you can, what were some of the points of divergence between the three, and where did you guys agree?
Yeah, so I think in general, there was not a tremendous amount of divergence. We've had for some time a set of dialogues that were a sort of weird love triangle where the United States would talk to the French, the United States would talk to the Brits, and then the French would talk to the Brits, right? And we'd all probably tell each other the same thing, but maybe we couldn't be sure. And I think some of us had pushed for a long time we should have more formal trilateral meetings. I wouldn't even call them consultation, but at least get together and talk, more formally. For example, CSIS has for a long time had trilateral track 2 dialogues trying to achieve the same thing. And I would, this is probably oversimplifying, but my view is the war in Ukraine sort of got everyone to agree doing that, at least in some form or fashion, on a formal track one level made sense, at least some. And, you know, it wasn't like we just talked about the war in Ukraine, but I think in general, all of us saw the situation. I'm trying to think if there were any significant divergences. Let me think about it for a minute. I can't remember any. I mean, there were some divergences in maybe emphasis, but in general, all sides agreed that, you know, despite, for example, early on, there was this special nuclear alert that Putin mentioned. I think we in general agreed that it was best not to overreact to this, or indeed even really react much at all beyond what we'd already done in response to the invasion itself. But I don't think there was any sort of broad disagreements in the nuclear communities. There were other dialogues between different parts of the government, and there may have been disagreements there. I know. I guess one area where everyone maybe had quite a slightly different take was that question of how quickly you can boil the frog. I think the United States was probably quite reticent on the speed at which you could do that. I would say that the Allies may have had different views. That's probably, but again, that was a sort of timing, tempo kind of thing, not a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the crisis, about what was going on, about what kind of responses we need.
Thomas, member.
Thanks so much. I have a somewhat boring sausage making question.
Great, love those.
To my knowledge, 2022 was the first time the nuclear posture review was published as nested within the National Defense Strategy. I was curious if that reflected a change in how those documents were drafted. Was the process kind of more integrated between those two teams? And, you know, if so, do you think that's a good thing, or if not, do you think that would be a good thing?
I think it was a good idea in theory, and we had talked about it a lot in the Joint Staff, and the vice chairman at the beginning of the Biden administration, General Hyten, was, I think, a proponent of having a more integrated review of strategic capabilities and strategy, right? So I think in theory, it was a good idea. I think in practice, it was probably unsatisfying to all in that we had a national defense strategy team, a missile defense review team, and a nuclear posture review team, all of whom had their own meetings that, you know, would sort of have some crosstalk. But I think it was much more, in my view, I think others would probably disagree, but in my view, it was much more three independent reviews that were lightly lashed up. And, you know, certainly there was a big effort to make sure there was nothing in conflict between them. But I don't think we achieved the level of integration that I think General Hyten and others envisioned. Would it be a good thing to do a truly integrated strategy review? I think so, as I sort of alluded to, partly by the interference of Congress, partly by the fact that things have just gotten complicated. We have started to balkanize a lot of our strategic capabilities. So, you know, my office was just one of the few places where the space people talked to the nuke people because they all had to come to my damn staff meeting, right? Like in other places that was less and less true. Nukes lived under space policy for a while, but cyber had been separated out. And even in that ASD for space policy, which you can ask Vipin about this, there was some bifurcation of responsibilities, and really they didn't come together solidly except at the very top. And of course, even there, Vipin clearly focused more on the nuclear portfolio, and his boss, John Plum, focused more on the space policy portfolio. So in general, I think integration is really important and a good idea. It's just kind of hard to execute when you have, you know, a broad set of regional and functional portfolios that all have to be stitched together. Was that a good, boring sausage answer for you? Good.
Andrea.
That was a good segue. I was going to ask about nuclear posture review processes as well. So you talked about the volatility of slip event between 2018 and 2022. Where do you think are the other potential areas of volatility in nuclear posture review generation? And is there a better way to sausage make NPR through these considerations?
I think the sausage making of the NPR is okay. I think what is really needed for a lot of these things, but particularly for nukes, is you need the attention and commitment of the senior leadership and really the Secretary of Defense in order to ensure that the signed document of the NPR is implemented fully. The way it works out in sausage making practice these days is everyone has realized over the past, I don't know, decade or two, that signing a document makes you feel good, but doesn't actually do anything. And so there has to be an implementation process. And for the past two NPRs, there have been highly engineered implementation process with lists of tasks and offices of primary responsibility and offices of coordinating responsibility. And we'll have meetings every so often to see who's done all their homework. And that works okay, particularly when it really is just sausage making, like task to the Joint Staff, update this planning guidance to reflect the nuclear posture review. Got it, boss. I will do that. It will take me 6 months because I'll have to coordinate with God and or everybody, but I can do that. It's the things that are somewhat contentious, like a new capability, like a nuclear sea launch cruise missile, where that implementation, that sort of checklist approach kind of falls apart because the list doesn't just get checked for those items. In my view, the folks in the cost analysis and program evaluation part of the Department of Defense, the inheritors of the Program and Analysis Evaluation Office, Barry Posen, also known as People Against Everything, lived up to their reputation. Yeah, fair enough. I know you spent a minute there. And we're like, yeah, it's cute that your nuclear posture review decided we needed a new capability. There's a way we do this, and we're going to do it our way. And our view in the nuclear nerd joint staff community was, look, this document that says we'll have a new capability was signed by the Secretary of All Defense. You should just go do this. And CAPE was like, well, the Secretary can tell us to do that, but it turns out you're not the Secretary. So, and so that's really what is needed in these contentious bits is people to put their leadership. I will say, even though Slick Amen was not a good example, Secretary Esper, sort of at the end of his, his tenure was relatively short, but at least in 2020, he spent a lot of time on implementing the broader national defense strategy, which included the nuclear posture review, and I think did some good work by, telling the services, hey, that's not good enough. In one sort of, I think, telling moment, which many of us cheered, he was talking to some of the services about how long it took to nuclear certify capabilities. And turns out they were telling him it was going to take a long time because everything takes a long time now. And his response, appropriately snarky, was, how long did it take to certify the Enola Gay? And that was kind of a leadership shot across the bow of, I think you guys can go faster. And they got the message. So even that level of, moderate leadership engagement, I think, can help on issues that are contentious. But again, a lot of the implementation really is, bureaucracy doing its thing at its finest.
My friend from Norway, whose name I learned recently but cannot pronounce. My
name is Tormod Heidi. I'm from the Norwegian Defense University College. So we live only 40 kilometers from some of Russia's most advanced nuclear.
Yes, you do.
And due to the crawling of the Earth, the shortest trajectory line between Russia and the US goes across Norway and Spitsbergen and Greenland. So we are, of course, very concerned about the 2022 defense strategy when Biden integrated, that was mentioned here, integrated the conventional and the nuclear forces into the same document. I just wonder, how does that in a way affect the threshold for employing these kinds of weapons? And can we really be sure that US commanders has the necessary competence in terms of reading the local security dynamics in these very sensitive areas? Up in the high north, this is one of Russia's most crucial sensitive areas, and they have lost, maybe 1 million troops during the 3.5 years of Ukraine war. So the way up to the nuclear forces is much shorter now because they do not have hardly any conventional forces left on the land side. So I just wonder, how does this affect the threshold as seen from a US perspective?
Yeah, I think your point is correct about the Russians, right? They've issued new nuclear doctrine, which I don't think necessarily lowers the threshold for their nuclear use, but certainly provides more scenarios in which they might consider nuclear use. But it's really the Russians that have the vast arsenal of so-called non-strategic weapons. You know, the United States says publicly something like 2,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons in Russia. They're kept in central storage, but they could be issued to field commanders, et cetera. You know, the United States has nothing like that anymore. And to the conversation we had earlier, the sole authority for U.S. nuclear use remains the president, right? So nothing about that has changed. So no U.S. sort of local commander can, on his own authority, decide at the time to employ nuclear weapons. So I don't think the U.S. threshold has changed at all, either with the 2018 nuclear posture review. I mean, this idea of conventional nuclear integration is really more about thinking about the interaction effects of conventional and nuclear forces. How can conventional forces support nuclear operations? For example, in Europe, the United States maintains its sort of very small set of nuclear capabilities for NATO. Those being gravity weapons delivered off aircraft require conventional support. So that's one form of conventional nuclear integration. The other way is thinking about Russian nuclear use. How do you as a conventional force prepare for a battlefield that might be nuclearized? We thought about this a great deal 40 years ago. We have thought about this nearly not at all over the past couple of decades. So that's another form of conventional nuclear integration. It's less about lowering the threshold or changing the threshold than it is about thinking about a world in which nuclear use by one or more sides is very real now in a way that it wasn't for some decades.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could expand a bit on what you were saying about how there's transformation of how China is thinking about nuclear C2, and then perhaps how that compares or contrasts to how other nuclear powers C2.
I think China is becoming a regular big nuclear nation, right? So for a very long time, as far as I can tell, their nuclear decision making was relatively decentralized in the sense that it was a Politburo decision. It was a collective decision, at least whoever survived of the Politburo, because their entire force structure was aligned to a no first use policy. Their weapons were not kept at high readiness. Politburo had to make a collective decision, perhaps some days or weeks or God knows how long after a nuclear attack by an adversary. And so you had collective decision making, fairly slow response time, et cetera. And you know, my view is that that was okay for China for what it asked of its nuclear arsenal for much of its history, which is we're a big country, probably nobody's going to invade us. Let's put an asterisk by 1969, and we can maybe talk about that a little more. But we do worry about people using nuclear weapons against us. But we think the threshold to deter a sort of unprovoked nuclear attack by an adversary is pretty low, right? That it doesn't require very much to deter that. They may or may not have been right about that, but that was the view, I think. As they ask more of their nuclear deterrent, which I think has a lot to do with their role both in the Western Pacific, but also globally, they've started to look more like the United States and Russia and even, you know, France and the UK. So centralized, singular decision making. As far as we can tell, this is now a Xi Jinping show in a variety of ways, of which nuclear command and control is one. That is a transformation, right? That is a fundamental transformation. It is one that, you know, I'm not wildly uncomfortable with, given that it does look like the United States system, the Russian system, et cetera, but it is a transformation. Their forces, at least according to public US documents, appear to be moving towards a posture where they might execute something called an early warning counterstrike. So that's not just a response after an adversary's nuclear weapons have already landed, but before they land. Again, something the United States and Russia have thought about. The United States makes its stated position that it doesn't rely on that, but it does not rule that out as a potential option. So again, I'm not wildly uncomfortable with this, but it is radically different than how China thought about it. To do early warning counterstrike, you got to have missiles ready to go more or less at a few minutes notice. That's a transformation, right? These are the transformational aspects. More, it's important, but it's not transformational. Different stuff, that could be transformational because it starts to think about, you know, the dual use systems for theater use. That looks a little different, but it's really that core transformation in readiness and how nuclear decision making is made that I think is no kidding transformation.
My question is a simple one. Thanks for your talk. What are three book recommendations you have concerning related to this topic? And if I'm on my phone, I'm not being rude. I'm right.
No, I mean, be on your phone all you want. It's not going to bother me. I'm just here for the lunch. There are a bunch. So I will recommend the ones that I like, which is not to say that the others aren't good. They're just, these are, one is my fellow MIT PhD and comrade in arms that's been mentioned at least once already, Brendan Green, a book called The Revolution That Failed. It is, I think, one of the better critiques of the nuclear revolution that we just talked about earlier. I will self-promote a little bit, but also promote Brother Charlie Glazer, a book called Managing U.S. Nuclear Operations in the 21st Century that Charlie and I co-edited with Brian Rudzinski. It's an attempt to update another very thick, good book called Managing Nuclear Operations. Both of those are worth looking at. I think Managing Nuclear Operations in the 21st Century does, it's more up to date for somewhat obvious reasons. There's a line in the original Managing Nuclear Operations about this magical future time when everybody will have a computer. So, I think the truths are still there, but maybe it required a little updating. So I'd recommend Managing Nuclear Operations 21st Century. And then I would probably just recommend The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution. It is still the foundational text in that, and it is wonderfully well written by Bob Jervis, who is an amazing human being, and also, he was a good writer in a way that social science has kind of drifted away from emphasizing being a good writer and more I'm going to beat you over the head with whatever it is we call social science these days. So those would be my three recommendations.
So speaking of Charlie Glazer.
As also a process question, when on the joint stage, if you needed technical advice on things that were just not common knowledge, like that, like what would the nuclear weapon do to a satellite a certain distance away, or so on and so forth, where were the places you would go? Who's got the expertise? So I'm sure it varies by the question, but
yeah. I had a great job in a lot of ways because first and foremost, I had a $100 billion a year research assistant known as the intelligence community. I was sufficiently senior and sufficiently accessed that if I asked a question, somebody would feel like they owed me an answer. So that was a good starting place, both CIA and DIA, as well as the National Security Agency. But really, CIA and DIA had a briefer weekly from both. And if I had a question, but I also had a lot of personal relationships where I had people on speed dial. So there's a part of the Department of Energy's intelligence and counterintelligence organization that focuses on nuclear devices. I had the head of that, like literally on classified speed dial, where I'd be like, Aaron, I have a question. And if he didn't know the answer, he knew where to go to. We also had, and this is fairly normal, 3 detailees in my shop from each of the national nuclear weapons labs. So we had a detailee from Sandia, Lawrence Livermore, and Los Alamos. It was good for them to sort of see how the sausage was made, but also they provided their own expertise and sort of reached back into that apparatus. And then again, the personal relationships with a lot of the folks at the national labs. NNSA has a lot of expertise as well. So apart from DOE-IN, you could reach out to NNSA. Combatant commands were where I would get a lot of the information on like blue capabilities or the services, right? So if you're thinking about, the radiation hardness of US satellites, it's the services that built the damn things and they will provide that information. So that was the great thing about my job. As I said, it was an influence job. So I couldn't really tell people what to do, but I could kind of be like, the chairman wants an answer for this. And people would generally be like, yeah, the chairman kind of is a big deal, even if Austin isn't. So I probably ought to get that annoying bald guy an answer. So lot of opportunities. Then, beyond that, the think tank world, particularly the FFRDC world, they would usually be available, et cetera. So you asked about satellites and things like that, Aerospace Corporation, for example. So lots of opportunities to get information. And just as a parenthetical, it has gotten a lot easier to access sensitive information from a technical perspective in the US government in ways that I think are good. Technology has come a long way in assuring need to know, like with certificates and all of the cool things that you can do with cybersecurity. So whereas before, if you wanted to read particularly sensitive intelligence, you might have to like go to another part of the Pentagon or even another part of Washington, D.C. and look at something in hard copy. It's now much easier for folks that want to access sensitive information to do so electronically, again, with appropriate controls. So I'll just say that was also really useful, even though I know my team found it annoying because I'm one of those people that can listen to somebody briefing me while I'm looking at something else. And so I apologize to my team for being rude, but it allowed me to multitask.
Well, speaking of your office, how many people were there? How large or small?
It was at the end, not quite 40 people, and it covered the following responsibilities: nuclear weapons policy, strategic deterrence, space policy, information integration, which included electronic warfare, cyber, and information operations. It included countering weapons of mass destruction. It included subsea and seabed warfare, ? Sure, why not? That was another one of those, you're semi-competent and you have a Navy 06, take this job. So it ultimately ended up at not quite 40 people, including folks that were detailed from national labs and stuff like that. And it was a mix of civilian and military, probably slight majority of military, but lots of really solid civilians. And civilians provide, I think people understand this, but they provide a lot of the continuity as military officers typically come in for a 2 or 3 year tour on the Joint Staff. And it was one of the good things about my job. I was the only senior civilian in the J5 that ran a deputy directorate. All of my peers were flag officers, so they come for a year, come for 2 years, come for 3 years. It takes only a couple of those rotations before you're that guy that's been there forever and knows where all the bodies are buried.
Dan Siebel.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for this great talk. I wanted to go back to, maybe one of your more stressful times, I guess, in the Pentagon. And I want to ask a bit more about like cyber escalation and your thoughts on cyber. So something that stood out to me in your talk was about how there's concerns among the allies about Russian cyber activity. I just want to know a bit more what was the concerns, like runaway malware, inadvertent accidental escalation. And then also maybe hear a bit about like, what were we thinking about in that space as a potential response. And then you said something that I think is interesting and sort of captures some of the other parts of the conversation about integrating conventional and nuclear. How is cyber different in a nuclear crisis versus a non-nuclear crisis? Because I think when I think about the academic literature, it's mostly just about a conventional crisis. So any sort of thoughts on cyber broadly in these sort of
Any thoughts on cyber? Sure, absolutely. So I think a lot of the concerns with Russian cyber activity fell into sort of two buckets. One was things that would rise to the level of creating physical effects. And you saw some of that against, for example, power grids in Ukraine. But even then, it was mostly offline. There, at least theoretically possible to create real physical effects, like causing a steel mill to melt down, right? Where it's not just that it's offline, but it's been physically destroyed, or trains to wreck, or whatever. So I'd say that was one bucket of concerns. The other was more of a flavor with the physical sabotage, which we've seen, which is things that will not cross an escalation threshold, but will nonetheless impose consequences. So a variation of the stability and instability paradox. I think those were sort of the two broad buckets of concern about what the Russians might do. And obviously, if they chose to cross that threshold of causing physical effects in Ukraine, there was theoretically no reason that they couldn't decide to do that elsewhere. I will say we saw much more of the second flavor than the first, and it's a question about whether that was lack of Russian capability to create sort of catastrophic effects, lack of willingness, et cetera. But I do think we've seen both attributable to the Russian state, but also unattributable in the sense done by nebulous non-state actors that may or may not have state affiliation. We've seen more of that second. The Viasat attack that I mentioned was probably the big opening salvo, and I think that kind of set the tone. We thought we were going to see a lot more of that, and the fact that we didn't was, as I say, interesting. How do you think about responding? I think here's where, again, allies varied. I think the United States was probably a little more reticent in thinking about this than some of our allies. And I think some of it is, I don't know if lack of comfort is the right word, but we just haven't, it's new to a lot of policymakers, right? This tool, which seems to be able to do many things and yet may be able to do nothing. So in some sense, I think some senior policymakers were like, well, if all you can do is basically cyber annoyances or cyber graffiti, why do I run any escalation risks whatsoever? Because that just seems silly. And it's like, so you want me to spinal tap and dial this up to 11? It's like, God, no, I don't want you to do that. And it's like, well, what do you like? Pick a thing. And I think we ended up not being able to pick a thing because we were either sort of thinking too low and like, why run any escalation risk for that, or too high, and God, no, that was clearly going to cause escalation. So I think that was probably a challenge for U.S. policymakers. I think some allies had a different view, and in some cases we're probably more willing to do things than us.
Florian.
Thank you very much for this information. I
will be happy to come tell people how hard extended deterrence is if that's helpful in Paris.
If you have 1 hour or two, I may speak about that, but a very precise question. Speaking about discussion with the French and the British, who were your contacts precisely, and from which institution?
So generally, I mean, I had counterparts on the French Joint Staff, as well as in the MOD. So those were changed over time, but had both military and civilian counterparts. And then in the UK, their system is a little more integrated, but also a military counterpart, as well as civilian counterparts. But they were all military / MOD. And again, at the sort of our systems are not quite perfectly aligned, but essentially my peers at the assistant secretary flag officer level. I don't know if that answered your question. I mean, you probably know some of my, Bertrand Lemur, for example, on both. Actually, a lot of my portfolio was my counterpart in France.
Diane.
So I'm interested in your thoughts on current policy regarding the use of artificial intelligence in nuclear decision making, whether you think current policy does enough, should do more, and what specifically.
Yeah. So it's easy to get tripped up on your Skynet and your Colossus, the Foreman projects here. But if you break nuclear command and control into sort of its 5 component parts, there's probably one where you have to be quite cautious, and then there are others where maybe a little easier to employ artificial intelligence. So situation monitoring, what the hell is going on, is a big part of nuclear command and control, and you don't want to entirely abrogate that to artificial intelligence, but there may be piece parts of it. So for example, data fusion for the president, where artificial intelligence could be very helpful. Planning is another one. That's another aspect of nuclear command and control, where again, artificial intelligence to run through scenarios, Whopper style, might actually be useful, particularly in peacetime, if you think about effects. Force management, so just sort of like how all the pieces are moving and generated. Artificial intelligence that in many cases is a logistics question. I think our friends in industry are finding good ways to use artificial intelligence to help with logistics, so that might be another one. Again, not saying that you just go whole hog on all of these, but I think there's at least an envisionable role for artificial intelligence in those bits. It's really the actual decision making, the sort of nuclear decision conference decision making, where I think it becomes tricky. And the United States has said very clearly that it's always going to be, at least in our case, a human's decision and the president's decision. But then you think about, are there decision aids that artificial intelligence can provide? And then that's still kind of tricky, because there's a worry, and you already see this in sort of employment of AI in professional settings, that if the super smart AI says this is what you should do, Mr. President, then the president's just going to be like, what else can I do? The AI is really smart. I'm not. I don't think that would happen, right? But that's the worry. And so that's where I think the most caution has to be put into place, is around the actual decision making. But if you talk about the sort of step back from AI and just talk about machine learning, parts of the intelligence community, particularly the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, they do imagery analysis. We're in a world now where there are gajillions of images, that's a technical term, and they want machine language to tip and cue human analysts to what are the most relevant pieces, so that to be able to manage the massive data that's available. That seems really reasonable as a use for AI ML. Even apart from the NC2 function, but it seems reasonable in NC2 as well.
Also, the two finger.
Yeah, real quick.
Okay.
It has to do with the decision making. You had on there, you did wargaming. Right now, there's a big discussion of wargaming and use of AI. Since that's kind of training the decision makers how to make decisions, what's your view on that?
It would really depend. I mean, as you know, war games can be for a variety of purposes. Most of the ones, though not all of the ones that I participated in, or many of them I helped build and run, were really more about exploration and sort of decision maker training, right? They weren't about what the Wargaming Lab here does more of, which is sort of using it as a research design tool. AI could potentially be useful in those scenarios, but to your point, I would worry a little bit about the fact that you have this possibility of brain rot, or whatever you want to call it, from, well, the AI says this. That said, I do think for wargaming to be useful, we need to be able to do more of it and faster. And so to the extent AI helps with that, it's probably worthwhile.
Ron.
Okay. On the Russian space thing,
Yes.
how far did they get? Did they ever deploy any part of it? The space nukes.
Yes. We get into, my Zap collar will get me for talking about classified stuff. If they have done it, we have not said it. We believe, and you can sort of figure out which satellite she was talking about fairly easily, but I won't say. An assistant secretary of state identified a satellite that was on orbit that we believe is associated with the program, but is not nuclear armed. So if they've done it, we haven't said it.
So you think they might have something on the launch pad ready to be launched on short notice?
All right. So now I'm going to depart from whatever it is might be true and just talk a little bit about how I think the Russians have come to think about this capability. I believe in their mind that this was an asymmetric way to counter US space superiority of the kind that proliferation brings. And proliferation, I mean proliferation of satellites, right? So we've talked a lot in the past few years about Starlink. Starlink is really hard for the Russians to the extent they have counter space capabilities, some of which they've tested, like a direct descent anti-satellite weapon. That's a pretty expensive weapon, and it's okay if you're targeting a big expensive satellite. If you're targeting what are essentially throwaway Starlink satellites, you're on the deeply wrong side of the cost curve. So from the Russian perspective, they're like, we need something that will zap all of these things. And they're Russian, so the first thing they think of when they want to zap all these things is, of course, nuclear weapons, because they're still really good at that. So why put it on orbit, right? Because you can already launch a nuclear weapon into space from the ground. On my slide, I had Starfish Prime. That was a 400-kilometer-ish detonation that we did back in the 1960s that we launched from the ground. I think they got a few things out of having a weapon on orbit. One is it allowed them to do this without any signature. So if you launch a missile into space, we have capability to detect that. So we would be able to attribute what just happened to them pretty clearly. That would not be true if the weapon were on orbit. If it were a secret, as I believe they intended, it would take us a while just to figure out what the hell just happened, right? It would be some things that some of our sensors would detect, and then a bunch of satellites dying. And from context, we could probably start to attribute, but it would have been a shocking way to cross the nuclear threshold. Shocking in the sense of, hey, America, wake up and smell the coffee. Maybe you need to knock off what you're doing. Without actually killing anyone other than potentially some poor taikonauts and cosmonauts and astronauts. So it was a potentially unique capability in their portfolio that they could employ well into a war, for example. So if the war in Ukraine had become one that involved NATO, this was a capability that they could employ to, in their mind, turn off the US space superiority, which would play to their strengths. It would also collateral damage China, which is an interesting question in itself, how they thought about that. It's less EMP than it is just the direct effects on Chinese satellites. China is a space power now in a way that the Soviet/Russians were not. So the Chinese have a bunch of stuff on orbit that would be affected in the same way that everybody else's satellites would be. What's interesting is if this was an ace in the hole capability because it was going to be secret, now it's not. And the Russians believe the United States has its own counter space capabilities. Seems like a reasonable supposition given that we've had those capabilities in the past. May or may not be true, but it's a reasonable supposition. If the capability is not secret, it is probably vulnerable to preemption. And so if we're in a crisis with the Russians, a capability they might have felt comfortable holding, they might actually feel preemption pressures. And so as I alluded to earlier, I don't get the vapors over strategic stability very much, but this seems to be one in which a pretty powerful and unique capability for the Russians might be seen as vulnerable early in a crisis, which might put pressures on them to use it early in a crisis. So I don't think we're there yet. I do not believe there is one sort of on the launch pad ready to go. But at some point, they may believe this is a capability they need to have. Because again, it's plausibly deniable, right? We could say this was this satellite, and they'll say, nah, that's like your word against mine, man, right? It will be very hard to prove in a technical sense exactly what happened to the satisfaction of a world that might not be wanting to believe. Our allies will probably believe, but what will China say? What will the Indians say? That I think is more of an open question.
Well, that brings us to the end of time. Some of you haven't been able to ask your questions, which I apologize. A few of you are actually coming to lunch, so you'll get a second stab at your questions with Austin. Quick note before we thank Austin for a terrific session. There'll be no seminar next week, so we'll be reconvening in 2 weeks' time. So for now, Austin, thanks to you. That was absolutely terrific. We all learned a great deal, and I'm sure it generated even more questions that people will be hounding you in the hallways to answer. So please try to be thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.